That's what we've got.
That looks delicious.
Yeah, well, this is officially
Hmm.
our 100th episode. So I just said to
Yeah.
Josie, I was just about to record our 100th episode. She was like, "Oh, I didn't even make you a cake for it." So she's quickly, in about 5 minutes, whipped this up. I'm going to show it to the camera, and obviously, people listening aren't going to be able to see it. But hold on,
Oh, oh,
yeah. So we've got a Rice Krispie finger with
nice.
chocolate on top, and then two digestive biscuits, um, signifying the 100. And she's decorated them ever so lovingly with chocolate, like ganache,
Icing.
piped
Oh,
it on top, and then stuck some
fancy.
candles on. So I'm gonna light them while
Yeah,
me and Kate are talking because we wanted to celebrate our 100th episode with everybody
we did.
because it's when we started this podcast, never in our wildest dreams did we go, oh yeah, when we get to our 100th, or we didn't ever think we would get to a 100. We didn't plan it. It's not,
No.
it's a surprise. I can't light these candles. I can't talk and play with fire at the same time. Oh
Practice.
no. Oh, that one's lit. Oh, it's sparkling everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to show you. Oh, if they're not having it, one's lit. That'll do. Take a little picture for everybody. I'm just having a party here by myself with
Yeah.
my sweets and.
Party.
So, our 100th episode. Um, we have got an absolute treat for you.
Oh
You will
my
have already
goodness.
seen the title of this episode. But I mean, this is lengthy. This is going to be a lengthy episode. Right. So because this episode is going to be quite a long episode, but also this is the first episode in I don't know how many yet because I've not finished writing it.
It's a
It could
series.
be, it will be more than two. It could well be more than three. It's a very, anybody that knows the story knows that there is so much to it. And so I think we're going to just jump straight into it and we're going to go random blams. Go. So my random blam is about the East End, London, in and around this time. So there was almost a population of 5 million in London in 1888, and 2 million of those lived below the poverty line.
Blimey. 2 million.
2 million out of 5 million people lived below the poverty line.
It was far more like extreme then, wasn't it? Like you were either rich or you were like dirt poor.
Yeah. Yeah, there wasn't any like state benefits or.
So the Great Plague in London killed a third of Europe's population,
And when was that? 16 something.
like 1665. The Great Plague killed a third of Europe's population, like the whole of Europe. It took out a third,
Mm-hmm.
which is like crazy.
Crazy.
Crazy. Yeah. Well, there you go.
All right then. Thank you. Random
Random
blams.
games.
Done.
Done.
So before we deep dive into this episode, we've got a few quick shout outs to give.
Down, down.
And that is Gabrielle. A
Hey.
massive shout out to Gabrielle, who's joined our little Blamly, and she is subscribed to get the additional Blam episodes and all the other Blam episodes that we have
Yay.
released.
Thanks, Gabrielle.
And I'm ever so sorry for this next shout out if I do butcher your name.
I think you
I
probably
think
will.
it's pronounced Kaylee, but it's Ceilidh. I
Oh,
think it's pronounced Kaylee. I didn't want to say it wrong and offend
yeah.
our little newest Blamley member. So I did do a little bit of a Google not translate, but like a Google help me out.
Yeah.
And I think it's pronounced Kaylee, but apologies if it isn't.
Let us know.
English language is not my not my strong suit at the best of times.
Not mine.
But thank you ever so much
Thank you
for
so much.
subscribing to our little podcast. We're on our 100th episode.
Yeah. And we've got loads of people in our Blamley now,
It's
which is
not even a
awesome.
little podcast anymore, is it?
Oh, it's just
Massive.
podcast. Yeah.
All right,
Taking
well,
the world by storm. Thanks,
Oh,
guys.
show.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Also, we did have a text message that I saw.
We did.
But I don't know who it was from. Do you know who it's from?
I think it's from Renee.
I did think that. Yeah.
I think it's from Renee. So unless you put your name, we don't know who they're from.
We can't see who
and
it's
unless you
from.
leave an email address, we can't reply back to it. I think it's from Renee.
Yeah, who was going on a trip. And she said she's going to be stockpiling all the episodes so that she can
listen to
out.
him in bulk.
Yeah.
Bulk listen.
Bulk listen, yeah. So hope you're either enjoying your trip, Renee, or have enjoyed your trip, or going to enjoy your trip.
Safe journeys, safe returns,
safe
all that.
Journeys.
Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
I'm a little bit nervous for this episode.
I bet you are.
I'm a little bit nervous. Which
big story.
I don't normally get because I normally do all of my research and I feel quite comfortable in the story. But this story is so massive, so huge that I kept saying, I'm so intimidated by this story.
Yeah,
so intimidated by the story because I should tell you for why. There is so much information out there and so much varying information out there. Yeah. And there's so many what the people call themselves ripperologists, experts on the Ripper case. So if you are a ripperologist and you've stumbled across this podcast and you think, oh, I'm going to listen to this is going to be full of factual information, it might not be. All right. No.
We've done our best.
I've done so much research and I'm presenting the facts as I've found them and found them to be most credible. And I've listened to a lot of other podcasts. And what I'm going to say is that if there is a podcast on Jack the Ripper that is one episode and is an hour long, it's not very good. Throwing it out there. You cannot cover this story in an hour. You simply can't. Now, I have left out some information that I found irrelevant because if I deep dived into every single aspect of this case, we'd be looking at about 10 episodes.
So, no, I get that.
I have left out some information. So if you're looking for a bit by bit of Annie Chapman's life from start to finish, that's not in here. There are plenty of books that you can read to get that information. There are plenty of sources on the internet where you can get that information. So
we have to limit it somewhere. It's
not that I've left them out because I don't know the facts. It's that I've left them out because I found them irrelevant to the story as I see it. And this is my representation of the story. And I know that we will get some backlash, but actually I don't even care because
come at us.
But I have done my absolute best to represent this case as I can do. And what we need to remember is that this happened in 1888. Nobody alive can tell us this story firsthand. So all of these accounts have travelled varyingly, like across everybody's lips. So it's like Chinese whispers. Some information gets scrambled. So there might be some information that you've heard differently elsewhere, but the facts of the actual case remain the same. So
yeah,
I hope you enjoy, and it is without further ado that I say to you, this comes with a trigger warning.
an old, disgusting trigger warning.
This comes with a trigger warning, which you will know. If you don't want to hear the disturbing details, then you're in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm nervous.
Don't be nervous. We're all here for you.
All right. It's 1888. It's the East End of London, Whitechapel specifically. It's an area affluent with skilled immigrants, mainly Jewish and Russian, that had flocked to the city of London with the promise of a better life, with the promise of more work. And, there's a promise that they didn't live up to. The streets were gas lamp lit. So they were very, very dark, very dank, very foggy, very very nasty places to be. And these horrible dark streets, they didn't offer these newly flocked residents of Whitechapel what they had been promised, because life in 1888 was extremely difficult. Victorian London was not a happy place to be. The area was steeped in poverty, destitution, squalor, crime, violence, everything that comes from living below the poverty line. The streets were unimaginably dirty. The air was thick with pungent smells of sewage and filth, and the night was dark and gloomy and dangerous. Surviving in Victorian London meant cheap, hard labour, tailoring, boot making, the slaughterhouses, and very physically demanding jobs. There weren't any offices to work in, these were all very hands-on, very tough, grueling work. These professions came with very little job security, and the work premises that were often small, cramped, horrible rooms with no natural light. It just wasn't a nice place to work. It wasn't comfortable like what we have today. But people were lucky if they had permanent work. Day-to-day work came in the form of workhouses. So if you wasn't fortunate enough to have a permanent job, a place of work where you went to every day, you could get day-to-day work in the form of these workhouses. And these workhouses were set up to offer food and shelter to the most poverty-stricken in return for hard, grueling labour in even worse conditions than what I've already mentioned. So workhouses were set up under the poor law system, which came about in 1834. So this was basically a scheme for the poorest and most desperate people to get them off the streets and to get them back into work, to get them kind of, back on their feet and back out into society, which sounds great, right? These people had fallen on hard times and they needed just a little bit of a leg up to get them back on track. And that was what these workhouses promised. However, they were nothing of the sort. So they were intended to provide basic shelter, food, and work, but they were also designed to be harsh and uncomfortable to discourage people from relying on them. And when I say harsh and uncomfortable, the work that these people had to do was the lowest of the low, the work that nobody wanted. The work was grueling and intended to be a punishment or of sorts. Tasks were repetitive and unskilled, and they were actually designed to instill discipline. rather than provide any sort of meaningful employment or training, or anything that they could use out in the real world. In some cases, these tasks were symbolic of their situation, or even pointless. They were just pointless tasks, and they were designed to discourage people from ending up in these workhouses. People, they didn't want, like what we have today with the like benefit system, where people get comfortable and they tend to rely on these benefits. They didn't want people to rely on these workhouses as an easy means of survival. So they made them horrific. So some of the jobs given to people in these workhouses, women mostly were given tasks like sewing, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing, needlework. But there were many other jobs that were very, very physically demanding, such as bone crushing.
Oh.
One of these jobs was that they would have to crush the bones of animals manually into dust, and that would provide fertilizer. So they had to manually crush these bones. They would walk the treadmill for 8 hours a day, and the treadmill being a device that you walked on that basically turned the mill, and it ground the wheat and it produced flour. And that's where the term treadmill comes from as well. And these people would have to walk on there for 8 hours a day, no breaks, continuous walk. And they wasn't a flat treadmill like what we have. They were almost stepped, like a stairmaster type situation. So it wasn't just walking on a flat surface. It was hard work. You had to essentially turn this mill round and round and round. So it was very hard to do. There were other jobs, stone breaking, and people would manually break up rocks and things for gravel. Gypsum crushing, which they would use to make plaster. Oakum picking, which they would, from what I could, I don't know. What I researched was that they would pick these, they were like fibers, and they would be used for making things, but they would have to pick them out of old hemp ropes that from like Navy ships and things. It was very, very hard work on the hands, and it would often like they would be bleeding and all sorts. The workhouse environment was highly regimented, very strict rules, very limited freedom. They called them inmates. That's what they called them. They would face harsh discipline if they broke any rules. And trivial infractions could result in punishments like isolation and reduced food rations. So it was almost like a prison camp.
Yeah, it sounds more like a prison than
and
like
they were
a benefit system, doesn't it?
They were whole families would come to these workhouses, but they would be separated. And the reason they were separated was because they didn't want the families to be comfortable there. So they would separate these families because they then wouldn't want to be there. They also were given uniform. And I say inmates, but workers, they were given a uniform, and the uniform had stamped on them the name of the workhouse, the specific workhouse that they had entered into. And so if they, left for the day, they would have to walk about in these clothes. And that brought further shame to anybody in these workhouses. And it was almost like people would rather be out on the streets than be faced with the notion that they had to go into a workhouse. It was the epitome of poor, these workhouses. So in return for their hard work in the workhouses, people were offered living quarters, children, everything. The children were put to work as well. There was actually in some workhouses an infirmary where you could go to and get medicine for the sick. And oftentimes a lot of elderly people would end up in these infirmaries and workhouses.
Yeah, I bet they were busy, the infirmaries, because there must have been a lot of disease and there.
So this next bit, the workhouses were over capacity in most cases. The dormitories were incredibly crowded. Beds weren't beds. They were just wooden platforms. There wasn't a mattress. There wasn't covers. There wasn't anything. They were covered in bugs and lice and all sorts of things. They weren't cleaned. It was, like you said, because of it being overcrowded, there was significant health and hygiene issues. And when I was writing this, I thought, I've actually written in here, think back to the asylum episode that we did and the treatment of these people in there. It was kind of a very similar thing. The food was scarce. Many people would often face starvation in there. And it got to the point where people would actually fight over the bone crushing job just so that they could pick off the rotting flesh or get access to the bone marrow of these bones so that they could survive. And it would be a case of, if they saw in this line of bones that were coming down, and they'd see a horse bone, or so like a big bone, because they had cat, dog, they smaller animals in there as well. But if they found these big bones, all these men would fight over this bone, and then they would run away, hide the bone, and then at a safer time go and pick the flesh and suck out the bone marrow of these disgusting bones. And the workhouses were actually shut down after this came out to light, but that was a few years away. But it was often thought that if you went into a workhouse, you would come out in a coffin. So it really wasn't the place people wanted to go. Therefore, they would turn to other means of getting money, crime, prostitution, violence, any other means of getting by other than going to these workhouses.
Yeah, don't blame them. Blimey.
So while work life was grueling and harsh, home life offered nothing better. Those fortunate enough to have a home or more than one room would turn their homes into makeshift brothels, or they would rent out the rooms on a nightly basis. People didn't live in a house like me and you live in a house. They lived in a room of a house, or they lived on the top floor of that house, or they owned a bed in that house. So housing was extremely overcrowded, with entire families or just groups of strangers crammed into a single room. And that single room was used for cooking, eating, and sleeping. There was no washroom. There was no luxuries. Sometimes there was 4, 5, 6 people in this one single room. They would share beds, sleep on the floor. There would be like rags covering broken windows. It would be flea or insect infested. And if you couldn't afford a room, there were lodgings where you could literally rent a bed for the night for a few pence. So there were lodgings, there were doss houses, there was all these different places. So a doss house is somewhere that you would stay on a nightly basis. A lodging is generally a little bit more of a permanent residence. So most of places where you could rent a bed for the night were 4 or 5 pence for a bed for the night. And if you couldn't afford the cost of a bed, there were other alternate arrangements. So these lodging options, like I just said, there was a lot of low cost accommodations. With some as cheap as a half a penny. So the beds were 4 or 5 pence a night, and half a penny got you something that was called halfpenny hangover. And this arrangement was primarily for those that were homeless or, pretty destitute and they had nothing. And it would offer them an alternate. Rather than sleeping on the streets, they could pay half a penny for this hangover. So for just a half a penny, those in need of a place to stay for the night could pay for this halfpenny hangover or a penny sit-up. And it would be a space. You would pay for a space to sit on a bench, not a bed.
Nice.
And often a rope would be strung across the entire room from length to length where this bench sat. In front of this bench, people would then sit on the bench. And if they fell asleep while they were sat on this bench, the rope was there to stop them from falling to the floor. And that's where the term hangover comes from.
That's so cool.
I know that when you was researching that, it kind of blew your mind a little bit.
Yeah, I had no idea. No idea that that's where the term hangover came from.
Yep. So
It was literal.
Literally hanging over this rope so you didn't fall on the floor. And these rooms were crowded, poorly ventilated. There was no blankets, no bedding, the rope provided minimal support for you to hang over. It wasn't comfortable. And then when morning came, they would whip out this rope and be like, off you go. Everyone out. That was it. You paid for your seat of a night. It wasn't a place for you to stay in the day. You paid for your nightly lodge there. There were penny sit-ups. For a penny, a person could sit on a bench all night without the rope, and this offered slightly more freedom. The bench wasn't quite as crowded. It was just as uncomfortable. And in some of these DOS houses, I read that they actually wasn't allowed to fall asleep because they hadn't paid for a bed. They'd only paid for a place to sit. Then they weren't allowed to fall asleep. If they started to fall asleep, they'd get woken up or told to get out because that's not what they paid for. And there was something called a 4-penny coffin. And for a slightly more expensive place to sleep, individuals could lie down in what was known as this 4-penny coffin. Now, this was a small wooden box or narrow cubicle, and it was just enough room to lie flat from head to toe. And you would get a thin, dirty blanket. And as you can picture, this kind of resembled a coffin in size and shape, which is why it was called a 4-penny coffin. So if you couldn't afford a house, then you could perhaps afford a room. If you couldn't afford a room, then perhaps you could afford a bed. If you couldn't afford a bed, then perhaps you could afford to sit on a bench. A coffin. And if you couldn't afford that, then you could sit on a bench all night. And if you couldn't afford that, you were literally on your ass out on the streets or ended up in these workhouses. And this is what I mean about these workhouses. People would rather pay half a penny to hang over a rope than go into one of these workhouses because they were just awful.
Hideous.
So these horrible working and living conditions resulted in large portions of the population turning to drink or drugs to cope with everyday life. Pubs and music halls lined the streets in the East End. They were, from one to the other, they were everywhere. Alcohol was very cheap and readily available, making it a very viable means of escapism for the down and outs. Dirty, unkempt children littered the streets in the daytime. They would be kicked out of their lodgings for the night. They would have to, there was no school for them to go to. They would oftentimes be naked because clothing was a luxury. They would be starving, begging, thieving. Obviously, they would be the prime targets for crime as well. Children were seen as a strain on parents' resources. And most of the time, 2 in every 10 children died before they reached the age of 5. And that could have been disease. Oftentimes these parents would be out until midnight, until the bars literally kicked them out. And then they would find their children, and their children, that would be the first time they would eat all day. So petty theft was rampant. There's no other word for it. The crowded areas, especially like markets, docks, busy streets, people would steal anything of value, so wallets, food, and small goods from the market stores, anything that they could use or sell. And many of these pickpockets would be young children, and these children sometimes worked in gangs. They worked on behalf of older criminals. Think Oliver Twist. He would be in charge of these group of children, and they would pickpocket what they could during the day and then come back and give their wares essentially, and then get food. And it was exactly that. It was like Oliver Twist. And I guess that's why that film is based on actual things that would happen in that time. So because of all of this crime and destitution, things like that, like brawls were a minute by minute thing. It wasn't like, every other night they've got to go somewhere. It's minute by minute they were breaking up bar fights. So they were completely unequipped to deal with the amount of crime that there was. There was more crime than there was police officers.
Yeah, I bet.
Police officers would have to walk in groups of 2s or 3s while patrolling at night because criminal gangs were rife and streets were dark. So they didn't feel safe on the streets of London. They wouldn't walk by themselves. So if, police officers wouldn't walk by themselves, women had to walk by themselves.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, there was an incredibly high rate of alcoholism. And you think, gosh, these people lived in such poverty-stricken areas. If they can't afford a halfpenny for their bed, how are they affording alcohol? Alcohol was very easy to come by and it was very cheap. And this alcoholism led to the increased crime rate. And the sheer volume of public disorder, drunken fights, bar brawls every night. It was just the police kind of always had the opinion of their petty things. If there was a bar fight or if there was a domestic or if there was anything like that, I'm not going to bother with that because actually so and so's been stabbed over there or so and so's been they kind of picked their battles when it come to crime because they just couldn't deal with everything. So and most of these issues were just what was going on outside of locked doors. And as awful as life sounds in the 19th century, in 1888 in London, it was so much harder for women. Domestic violence was a common and often unreported crime because most of the time people had the attitude that they deserved it. It was a lack of support for women. Especially if they was to have reported domestic violence, it wasn't a thing back then. They'd be like, well, you must have done something to deserve it. So police intervention in domestic matters wasn't a thing. It was very limited. They didn't really get involved. So many cases went unpunished but most cases went unpunished. And a lot of women did give as good as they got from what I read because they had to. They were tough, hardy women. They had to survive. It was a case of survive or don't. There was no other nothing else to it.
No help was coming, was it?
No, absolutely not. They're not going to call the police, are they? And people didn't bat an eyelid if they heard or witnessed domestic violence, out on the streets. You'd walk past it. At no point would anybody be like, excuse me, stop doing that, please. You shouldn't hit a woman.
Yeah.
The people were often of the case, I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
That, that's their life. What goes on behind closed doors is their business. It's not my business. So that was it really. And a lot of these women were financially dependent on their partners or their husbands. So what you'll see going through this story is that married women were either left their husbands or were kicked out by their husbands, and they ended up on the streets because they had no other means of survival. There wasn't many jobs for women. It's a man's world, and women were second nature.
Much like America today. Sorry.
So the lack of proper work and money led many women and young girls into prostitution. It was a service that was incredibly in high demand by those wishing to escape their awful lives. It was people that were married were separated because of alcoholism or for one reason or the other, and they would turn to prostitution, and then the men would turn to prostitution because they didn't have a wife. So it was like a big circle of hoes and prostitution and stuff. There were approximately 1,200 prostitutes on the streets of Whitechapel. Jeez. With 62 open brothels just in the area of Whitechapel. There were brothels everywhere.
Yeah. Jeez.
And prostitution at that time was only illegal if it caused a public disturbance.
Oh.
I think it was illegal, but police didn't do anything about it unless it caused a public disturbance. That's what I gather.
Like picking your battles again, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, that's what I said. Yeah, if the women are just, doing what they're doing, then
frolicking around everywhere.
Yeah, because it was so many of them. Yeah, so many prostitutes walking the streets that the police just was like, oh, what can I do?
Yeah.
So these women, they didn't have a home to go back to. They were on the streets. These weren't people that were prostitutes by choice. That they were prostitutes because they had no other means of feeding themselves, feeding their families. This was the only thing that they could do to earn money. So there were no hotels to shack up in. So these transactions would take place on the street, down these dark, disgusting alleys, in doorways. And women were like, oh, it's 5 minutes. That's it. They would just disassociate for a few minutes, job done. They would then earn their money for a bed that night, or they would earn their money for more alcohol in the day, which was often the case. These women were often referred to by the name unfortunates. They weren't called prostitutes or anything. They were called unfortunates. And I think the reason there is self-explanatory. Most carried all of what they owned on their person, and then they paid for their board and food with whatever they had earned in that day. But it was not a lucrative trade. They earned pennies. Lack of contraception and the inability to care for a child meant that back alley abortions were incredibly common, leading most women to die from the botched job, either from infection or from the procedure itself. And women were also an easy target for crime, and crime was everywhere. These women would be out past midnight looking for punters, and like I say, it was not like what it is today, where there's lights on. People have got lights on. There's street lamps or anything like that. It was dark.
Yeah.
Dark. So these women were a prime target for crime.
I bet they had loads of men that went to them that just didn't pay as well, or
probably
would just have sex with them, beat the crap out of them.
Yeah.
And then go.
Yeah.
It must have been terrifying.
Yeah,
women.
Well, there's a lot of some of these prostitutes were owned by a pimp, things like that. So even if the money that they did make, some of it went to them. It just the fact that these women would rather prostitute themselves than go to a workhouse, just says something, doesn't it?
It would have been a time where there was no light at the end of any tunnel.
No.
It's like, even if you got arrested and sent to jail, you would have thought, so what? It's not going to, jail is not going to be any worse than the workhouses, being on the street, sleeping, sitting up, leaning against a rope. Prison's not going to be any worse, is it?
Victorian London was not a good place to be.
Horrendous.
And I mean, this was in the East End of London. In the West End of London, it was a very different story. That was quite up and coming. That was where the higher class people lived. It was just the East End of London was not good.
Not good.
Just imagine these streets of London at the time and living in this time period of 1888, and how dark it is on the streets. Alcoholism was rife. Fights were everywhere. These fights could be men on men, men on women, women on women, women on men. So there were cries of help everywhere, shouting everywhere, people shouting murder, rape, fire, everything going on all the time. So people just didn't bat an eyelid about these sorts of things that were going on because they were so common. The death of an unfortunate one of these women often went unreported and unnoticed, and it was seen as just another casualty in that line of work. And one such casualty was Emma Smith. In the early April of 1888, while working on the streets, Emma was beaten and gang raped by a group of men. After her attack, she managed to walk, I think it was about 300 yards, back to her lodgings on George Street in Spitalfields, which took her 4 hours to walk these 300 yards, where during her walk, she had passed different police officers, kind of seeking help, but being refused. They thought most of the time that these women were just drunk, so they just thought nothing of it. When she eventually got back to her lodgings, she informed a lady named Mary Russell that she had been attacked by 2 or 3 men, and she stated one of them was a teenager of about 19 years old. She was then taken to London Hospital, where surgeons found that not only had she been raped by these men, but an object had been used in the assault, which had caused severe damage to her bowel. It had ruptured her perineum, and it had done a whole lot of damage. And while she was there, Emma slipped into a coma, and then she died at about 9 a.m. that following morning. And this is a standout case because it marks the beginning of what is known as the Whitechapel murders. And the reason I've included it is because I'll include more as well, but we're this episode's not just based on Jack the Ripper, but on the Whitechapel murders, and we'll discuss the reason why at the end.
Okay.
But so I'm going to read you a newspaper article that was written in 1888 regarding the murder of Emma Smith, because I found a lot of information on that time, and I actually think it's incredibly fascinating, so I have included it. And it's from the Morning Post, and it just says murder in Whitechapel. And it says Mr. Wynne E. Baxter held an inquest on Saturday at the London Hospital with regard to the death of Emma Elizabeth Smith, aged 45, a widow, lately living at 18 George Street in Spitalfields. Mary Russell stated that Smith had been a lodger at 18 George Street for some months. On bank holiday, she left the house in the evening, returned home between 4 and 5 o'clock the next morning, severely injured, and said she had been shockingly treated by some men. Mr. George Haslip, house surgeon at the London Hospital, deposed that the woman was admitted suffering from severe injuries. She told witnesses that at 1:30 on Tuesday morning, she was going by Whitechapel Church when she saw some men coming. She crossed the road to get out of their way, but they followed her. They assaulted her and robbed her of all the money she had. She could not describe them, except that one looked a youth of 19. After her admission to the hospital, she gradually sank and died. On Wednesday morning, witness made a post-mortem and found that the injuries had been caused by some blunt instrument which had been used with great force. The instrument had penetrated the peritoneum and so set up peritonitis, which caused death. Peritonitis is like fecal matter in the blood, so it's like toxic shock, I guess. The coroner said that from the surgical evidence, it was clear that the woman had been barbarously murdered. Such a dastardly assault he had never heard of, and it was impossible to imagine a more brutal case. He had another thing coming, I'll tell you that. Vicious attacks and murders on women were not uncommon or out of place on the streets of Whitechapel. But things were about to take an even darker turn. Martha Tabram was a 39-year-old woman living in lodgings on George Street in Spitalfields. She was a mother of 2 boys, 17-year-old Frederick and 15-year-old Charles. So she was separated from her husband, Henry Tabram, due to her drinking problems, which he said was bad enough to cause alcoholic fits. So you'll see that a lot as well, that because of alcoholism, these women have been kicked out. And now living in squalor and out of work, Martha took to prostitution as the only way to support herself and her 2 children. And Martha actually took out a court summons against Henry, her ex-husband, for desertion. She said that he had left her with nothing. You know, he'd abandoned her and his 2 children. So he was made to pay her a weekly maintenance of 12 shillings. And he paid every week until he heard that she was making a living as a prostitute. And then, I'll talk about this in more detail a bit later, he was actually allowed to reduce what he was giving her because she was making an income from illicit means. So he then reduced her allowance to half a crown, which I don't know how much that is in today's money, but it's less than 12 shillings.
It sounds like a big drop, doesn't it?
Yeah.
12 shillings to half a crown. I don't know.
In 1879, he learned that she was then living with a man by the name of William Turner, and then he actually stopped her payments altogether. So she was now getting nothing. And William and Martha had a tumultuous relationship, and they tended to live in common lodging houses or renting rooms, just, you know, going from DOS house to DOS house. They didn't have a permanent place of residence. But Martha's drinking was still an issue, with William saying, this is a quote from William, "Since she has been living with me, her character for sobriety was not good. If I gave her any money, she generally spent it in drink. In fact, it was always drink. I am a man of sober habits as a rule, and we usually agreed well enough together as well as she remained sober. But when she got the worse for drink, I left her. There was no quarrel then. I simply left her." So now she had no one. And on the evening of the 6th of August, 1888, Martha had been at the local public house called the Angel and Crown, and she'd been drinking ale and rum. And rum is a very common drink for these women. Rum was very cheap. And she'd been drinking with another woman called Mary Ann Nichols, who was also a prostitute. And they'd been drinking with 2 soldiers that they had met. And at around 11:45, the 4 of them left the pub and then split off. Martha went with her soldier or client, and Mary Ann then went with hers as well. And Martha took her client to George Yard Buildings, which is like a block of tenement flats. They were called George Yard Buildings. In the very early hours of the morning, a resident of the building was awoken by the screams of a woman shouting murder. But because these screams were so frequent in the area due to like domestic violence and things like that, she just ignored it. At 3:30 a.m., another resident, Albert George Crow, returned home after a night's work as a cab driver. It says cab driver, but there were no cars, so a horse and cart driver.
Yeah.
And he actually noticed Martha's body splayed out on the landing above the first flight of stairs. But being 3:30 a.m. and there being no light, he couldn't whip out his phone and put the torch on. In the darkness that he had, he just assumed that she was drunk and had passed out. And it wasn't until just about 5 a.m. that a resident coming down the stairs on his way to work realised that she was actually dead. Martha was found lying on her back, her clothing raised above her waist, exposing her lower body, indicating to the officer that this could have been a sexual attack. Martha had been stabbed 39 times.
Jeez.
9 times in the throat,
Ugh.
5 in the left lung, 2 in the right lung, 1 in the heart, 5 in the liver, 2 in the spleen, and 6 in the stomach. And there were also stab wounds to her lower abdomen and vagina.
Oh.
And despite a police investigation, a suspect was never identified or charged with Martha's murder.
Brilliant.
Some people believe that Martha's murder is the first of the Ripper victims. But we will discuss this in the very last episode. But I wanted to, again, I've included a newspaper article from 1888 on the day after Martha's murder. And it says, "A Whitechapel horror." And this is from the Star. And it says, "A woman now lying unidentified at the mortuary in Whitechapel was ferociously stabbed to death this morning between 2 and 4 o'clock on the landing of a stone staircase in George's Buildings, Whitechapel. George's Buildings are tenements occupied by the poor labouring class. A lodger going early to his work found the body. Another lodger says the murder was not committed when he returned home at about 2 o'clock. The woman was stabbed in 20 places. No weapon was found near her, and her murderer has left no trace. She is of middle age and height, has black hair and a large round face, and apparently belonged to the lowest class." So I wanted to give you just a real understanding of what it was like in Whitechapel in 1888. Because even in her death, she's being marked as the lowest class.
Yeah. Why so big round face as well? Why are they body shaming her as if she hasn't gone through enough, for God's sake?
She's got a large round face. So that's how tough women had it. Even in death, they were, the lowest class. And she had a knicker strewn above her waist. So yeah, I'm going to include more newspaper articles because I actually think they're so fascinating to read. So
no, it is, because it gives you a complete view of how people conducted themselves, almost like how they considered women. And
and even just these attacks, like the first one, they called it dastardly, and the use of language that they use. And
Grandpa would have said that. Grandpa would have said that.
Dastardly.
Yeah, dastardly.
So now we move on to the first of what are called the canonical 5.
Nice.
So the canonical 5 are what are known as the 5 Jack the Ripper victims. Nobody argues really that these are Jack the Ripper victims, but there could be more that came before them. There could be more that came after them. Those are all up for debate, but these are actual Jack the Ripper victims.
Cool.
Mary Ann Nichols was a 43-year-old woman living in and around the Spitalfields area. She had fallen upon hard times due to her alcoholism, leading to the breakdown of her marriage. So she had left her husband and her 5 children and ended up working in Lambeth Workhouse for a short time before she actually found her feet again. And fun fact for everybody, parts of Lambeth Workhouse are still there, are still available to see near Elephant and Castle in London, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, that is cool.
Once she was out of the workhouse, she found work as an on and off cleaner, but she didn't last there very long. She ended up back in Lambeth Workhouse and then took to prostitution in order to survive. After hearing that his ex-wife was barely surviving, and she was down on hard times, and she was in these workhouses, and she'd taken to prostitution, he decided to stop paying her the weekly allowance of 5 shillings that he was legally required to pay her.
Nice.
So it turns out that if the partner or the ex-partner is earning money through illicit means, drug trading or anything else, prostitution, he was no longer required legally to support her because she was turning to illicit means to
surely it should be the opposite, shouldn't it? It's like if someone's desperate.
Yep. So out of money now, Mary found herself living on the streets of Trafalgar Square for a time, where she was arrested for wandering abroad without any visible means of sustenance. That's what she was arrested. Yep, that's what she was arrested for. So she was then removed from the streets of Trafalgar Square and ended up in another workhouse. A matron at that workhouse actually managed to find Mary a really good job as a live-in maid to a well-off family. So she lived there and obviously did everything that they could. But possibly due to her excessive drinking, she only worked there for 3 months before she was asked to leave.
Oh, man.
We don't know why she was asked to leave. It could be I read somewhere that people working as live-in maids had to work there for 3 months before they were paid. So they wouldn't get any money or anything for 3 months.
Oh, that's way long, isn't it?
It's
especially
way long.
Like when you need the money for like each night.
Yeah, well,
like
with a live-in maid, they had that was their lodgings. They stayed there. They got food as well, so didn't really need any money. But they obviously would need money for something.
Well,
telephone bill.
Yeah, mobile phone bill,
taxi fares.
Well, yeah, but I suppose, I mean, if she was an alcoholic,
yeah,
like
that's
would need
why
to feed her habit, wouldn't she?
Yeah,
so.
That's why. So whether it was that she was caught stealing, because actually when they asked her to leave, she did quite openly steal some expensive clothing worth £3.
Oh,
£3 and 10 shillings.
Goodness.
As she left, she was like, "Bye, bitch."
Bye, bitch. I'm taking this. I'm taking this.
Stolen all of those clothes.
I'm leaving you with this.
Funny. By August of 1888, Mary had found herself a regular bed in a common lodging house called the White House on Flower and Dean Street in Whitechapel, which sounds like a lovely area. Flower and Dean Street.
I don't think I could be in the actual White House at this moment in time, but.
So Flower and Dean Street is actually one of the most notorious slums of the Victorian era, being described in 1883 as, quote, perhaps the foulest and most dangerous street in the whole metropolis.
Blimey.
Yep. That's how Flower and Dean Street was described. But that was her common lodging. So although it was a common lodging, she still had to pay every night for her bed. If she didn't have the money, she didn't have the bed. It was as simple as that. Despite the fact that some of these women would build up relationships with the lodging manager or whatever, if they didn't have the money, that they were kicked out. It was as simple as that.
Was that more of a sort of rolling contract kind of thing? Like, it's your bed as long as every day I get the money for it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, they would have that regular bed. So bed 29 or whatever. That would be her bed. But if she didn't have the money, then that was it. She was out.
Right.
So on the night of the 30th of August, Mary had been drinking at the public house in Brick Lane in Spitalfields called the Frying Pan, which still stands today, although it's not a pub. The building stands. It's not a pub. She left there at around 12:30 a.m. and returned to her lodgings on Flower and Dean Street. She owed money for that night's lodgings, which she didn't have, after having spent what little money she did have on alcohol. So she was therefore kicked out of the lodgings at around 1:40 a.m. Mary decided to walk the streets, possibly looking for some work so that she could pay for a bed, and was seen at around 12:30 a.m. staggering and noticeably drunk by a woman named Emily Holland, whom Mary had previously shared a bed with in one of the lodging houses in Thrall Street. Like I say, these beds sometimes they would be sharing with a lot of different people.
Yeah. Don't blame them.
Emily tried to convince Mary to go back with her to the lodging house, but Mary refused, saying that she'd had her money for her bed 3 times that day, but had spent it and then needed to earn it again. She didn't seem bothered. She just said, "I won't be long and I'll be back." They knew how this worked. I'll just quickly go out, get myself a punter. It would be a few minutes. They would earn their money and then they'd go back. So she was like, "Listen, I won't be long." And then Mary walked off in the direction of Whitechapel Road. Between 3:30 and 3:40 a.m., a man named Charles Allen Cross came upon what he believed to be a bundle of tarpaulin laying on the ground in front of a gated stable entrance in Bucks Row, which was about 150 yards from London Hospital. For anybody that doesn't know, I don't know if tarpaulin is a regularly used word, but it's just a sheet of
plastic.
Yeah. It was pitch black. The street lighting was very minimal. Most people generally carried like matches so that they could get a closer look at things. They would light a little match and have a little look. And Charles thought that it was discarded tarpaulin, and he actually thought, great, I could use a bit of tarpaulin. Handy for me. So he went for a better look because he was like, I'm having that.
I'll have that. Yeah, yoink.
On closer inspection, Charles realised that this wasn't a bundle of tarpaulin, but in fact the body of a woman lying on her back with her eyes staring straight open, her legs out straight, and her skirt raised above the knee, with her right hand resting on the gate of the stable entrance. At that moment, another man on his way to work, Robert Paul, came upon the situation, and in the darkness of the night, they both examined this woman's body. Charles said he touched the woman's face and it was still warm, but her hands were cold and limp. So he told Paul that he believed that she might be dead, but Paul kind of listened to her chest and he felt like he'd heard her breathing. Said it was shallow, but she's breathing. So he thought that she was just unconscious. So together, they actually pulled down her skirt to cover her modesty. And they kind of decided that they were late for work.
Oh.
So we'll just carry on our way to work. But while we're on our way to work, we'll look for a police officer to inform them of what they found. While that was happening, though, while they moseyed on their way and tried to find a police officer John Neal, who'd been patrolling Bucks Row that night, happened upon the body. His lamplight cast a dark orange glow over the body, revealing a pool of blood and a dark red slit across the woman's throat. So he shouted for another officer in the area, PC John Thane, to attend the scene, and it was clear to both that the woman was dead. At 4 a.m, Dr. Llewellyn, I think it's pronounced Llewellyn, arrived at the scene after PC John had ran to get him. He observed 2 deep knife wounds across the woman's neck, and he felt her body, and he told the officers that she had presumably been murdered as little as 30 minutes prior to being first found.
Oh dear.
Her body was then moved to the morgue for a thorough post-mortem. Upon further examination of the body, Dr. Llewellyn discovered that both sides of her face had been bruised by either a fist or the pressure of a thumb before her throat wounds had been inflicted from left to right, this throat wound, and 5 of her front teeth were missing. One of these wounds on her neck measured 8 inches and the other 4 inches, both in length, and both were inflicted with such force that the knife actually cut through her vertebrae, through the bone. Aside from the obvious wound to her neck, there was a deep hacking gash that ran jaggedly from the left side of the lower part of her abdomen and as far up as the sternum, where the breastbone is, leaving her intestines exposed. There were also 3 or 4 similar cuts that ran down the right side of her body, and she had been stabbed viciously twice in the vagina. The mortician, the doctor there, proposed that all of the wounds had been inflicted with the same knife, and he estimated the knife to be at least 6 to 8 inches long. And he said it was possibly the knife of a cork cutter or a shoemaker. I'm going to highlight the area there where he says that the gash ran jaggedly down there. I'll keep that in the forefront of your mind.
Okay.
So after the autopsy, detectives started the task of trying to identify the woman. people didn't generally carry any identifying objects on their person. They didn't have anything really. The only thing on her person that she was carrying with her was a comb, a pocket handkerchief, a broken piece of mirror, and a little black straw bonnet that was actually new, and she was had shown off previously that day to people. Look at my little bonnet. Look at my little bonnet. And that bonnet was found lying next to her on the floor. It didn't take long before an image of Mary's dead body was circulated. And they also found that her petticoat and other clothing that she was wearing had the stamp of Lambeth Workhouse. So they decided to send detectives there to do some digging, and then it didn't take long until she was recognised as Mary Ann Nichols. The media whipped up an absolute frenzy. If you think the media nowadays is bad, then you should have seen some of these headlines from back then. That, you know, this was people's entertainment.
Yeah.
That was it. It was that simple. The newspapers, that's all they had.
I bet the headlines were things like "Strike a light, governor."
Strike a light, governor.
Strike a light, governor. Another one's hit the dust.
Yeah, I'll read you the newspaper headlines.
All right.
But this was how, you know, news got about. This is how word travelled, and it was grotesquely descriptive. There were pencil drawings of all the ghastly wounds and everything like that.
Limited censorship then.
There was no censorship.
None. Yeah, they were like, you know, just have it all.
Everything was laid bare. This is what happened. And so here is one clipping of a newspaper article from the 31st of August, which I believe was the day after. Yeah, it was the day after. Horrible murder in East London. Whitechapel mystery. And this is from the Pall Mall Gazette. And it says, scarcely has the horror and sensation caused by the discovery of the murdered woman in Whitechapel some time ago had time to abate, when another discovery is made, which, for the brutality exercised on the victim, is even more shocking and will no doubt create as great a sensation in the vicinity as its predecessor. The affair up to the present is enveloped in complete mystery, and the police have as yet no evidence to trace the perpetrators of the horrible deed. The facts are that as Constable John Neal was walking down Bucks Road, Thames Street, Whitechapel, about 4:45 this morning, he discovered a woman between 35 and 40 years of age lying at the side of the street with her throat cut right open from ear to ear, the instrument with which the deed was done tracing the throat from left to right. The wound was an inch wide and blood was flowing profusely. She was immediately conveyed to the Whitechapel mortuary, when it was found that beside the wound in the throat, the lower part of the abdomen was completely ripped open with the bowels protruding. The wound extends nearly to her breast and must have been affected with a large knife. As the corpse lies in the mortuary, it presents a ghastly sight. The victim seems to be between 35 and 40 years of age and measures 5 feet 2 inches in height. The hair is dark, features small. The hands are bruised and bear evidence of having been engaged in a severe struggle. There is the impression of a ring having been worn on one of the deceased's fingers, but there is nothing to show that it had been wrenched from her in a struggle. Some of the front teeth have also been knocked out, and the face is bruised on both cheeks and very much discoloured. Deceased wore a rough brown ulster with large buttons in front, a brown dress, and a petticoat which bears the name of the Lambeth Workhouse. The clothes are torn and cut up in several places, bearing evidence of the ferocity with which the murder was committed. A night watchman was in the street where the crime was committed, but he heard no screams and saw no signs of the scuffle. The body was quite warm when taken to the mortuary at 4:30 this morning.
Oh, poor cow.
But from the beginning line there, it says, it will no doubt create as great a sensation in the vicinity as its predecessor. So he's talking about Martha Tabram in that. So they're kind of grouped together. They've had all of these murders very close together. And actually, it had whipped up quite a sensation. It was quite the topic. But the police literally had nothing to go on. So little did they have that I actually can't really find much about the investigation. Other than that, after her death, an inquest was held, and then that's when all the witnesses kind of gave their statements as to how they'd come across her, and then they kind of narrowed down this timeline of events as to that when she would have died and when she would have been found, and it gave a little bit of a window of about half an hour for the killer to have done what he done, and then get away. Probably walking past a lot of these men on the way.
Yeah, probably walked straight
probably
past
covered
them.
in blood, but everybody was. There was, the slaughterhouses. Everybody had an apron that was covered in blood and things like that. It just wasn't an uncommon sight. But what they did do, the police, was that they began questioning the neighborhood prostitutes to see if there were any dangerous men on the streets or anybody that had come to their attention. And one name popped up quite frequently. And it took the police a long time to discover who he really was. But this man would be the first of many suspects. And his name was Leather Apron.
Leather Apron. It sounds like Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah. Well, the reason he was called Leather Apron is because he literally wore a leather apron.
And nothing else.
He was a leather worker, so he had this apron on all the time. But Leather Apron was known amongst the ladies because of his aggression and threatening behaviour with them. There was often stories that he would stalk these women of a night and then threaten them with a knife, rob them, rape them, attempt to kidnap them, that sort of thing. So he came to the forefront of police's attention quite early on. But we'll discuss Leather Apron in the suspect episode as well. However, word on the street was that it was a Jewish man, and so began the rise of anti-Semitism in Whitechapel, and a lot of people kind of used it as an excuse to hate on the foreign people. So they were saying that it was probably a Jew that done it and blah, blah, blah. So anti-Semitism is the word to describe our hostility and prejudice towards Jewish people. And the official police line was that they kind of blamed the actions on local gangs. That was their way of thinking. It must have been because local gangs were so rife in the area. They were like, it must have just been the work of a local gang. But some newspapers began to circulate a theory that a lone silent killer was at work, targeting the vulnerable women of the East End. The Star newspaper ran a headline and it says, "The third crime of a man who must be a maniac." And it speaks of great local excitement surrounding the case. So the people of Whitechapel believe that now that there is one person that has killed these three women. Because the term serial killer, like we discussed in the previous episode, wasn't a thing back then. So there wasn't actually, people didn't go, oh, it must be a serial killer. They said it was a lone killer. The term wasn't coined until, I think it's 1974. And then it was kind of backdated to fit the crimes of people that had killed more than two people. But it wasn't long before the police started to actually think that perhaps the newspapers could be right about a lone killer. Annie Chapman was a 47-year-old woman living around the Spitalfields area in London's East End. She had been married to John Chapman at the age of 28, and they had had 3 children together: Emily Ruth, Annie Georgina, and John Alfred. And as was the times, life was incredibly hard for them. At the age of 12, Emily Ruth died of meningitis. Their son, John Alfred, had been born disabled and then had been given up to be cared for. It said by a charity school. When I looked it up, I think it was something like Eddowes or something like that, where he went to live and be cared for because Annie Chapman and John Chapman, they couldn't care for him. And because of the difficulties of life at that time, both John and Annie turned very heavily to alcohol. She had been arrested several times for public drunkenness, and around 1884, John had finally had enough of Annie's alcoholism, and the pair separated. So despite the fact that he was also an alcoholic, and he actually died a few years later in 1886 of cirrhosis of the liver due to his own alcoholism, he had had enough of Annie's, and the pair had separated in 1884. By 1888, she was living at Crossingham's lodging house, which was number 35 Dorset Street, where she paid 8p a night for a double bed, with the money that she made from her crochet work and selling flowers, which a lot of women did at that time. They kind of made these handmade decorative flowers that they would sell. They would go to the West End, to these wealthier areas, to sell these handmade flowers for women to wear on their giant hats.
Yeah.
Because that's what... Yeah. That's what women did. And failing that, not making any money from... Because oftentimes they would travel to these wealthier areas and then not make anything and wasted the day and wasted any money that they did have on their travel or making these things. So failing that, she turned to casual prostitution. A bit of a top-up, side hustle. Shortly after midnight on the 8th of September in 1888, Annie had arrived at her lodgings knowing that she didn't have any money, and she just asked if she could stand in the kitchen for an hour or so.
Oh.
She hadn't been feeling particularly well that day. Just a few days prior, she had basically gotten an arse kicking from a fellow lodger called Eliza Cooper, and they had gotten into a fight about a slither of soap that Annie had borrowed and not returned. And it had literally ended up in a physical fight, this slither of soap, because Annie was like, fucking get your own slither of soap. Yeah. So yeah, this little tiny bit of soap had caused this physical fight. And it ended up with Annie sustaining a black eye, bruising to her jaw and cheek, and also at her chest. So since the attack, Annie had been visibly poorly, with a friend of hers called Amelia Palmer commenting on how pale she was and asking it if she had had anything to eat or drink. And when Annie told her that she hadn't even had a cup of tea that day, Amelia gave her some money with the express warning not to spend it on rum. Which, how many times I've heard that said to me. Gosh.
Claire says it to me every day. Every day I leave the house, she's like, don't spend all your money on rum.
Don't spend it on rum.
You dirty prostitute.
However, while at the lodgings that evening, standing in the kitchen just after midnight, she drank a pint of beer in the kitchen with two fellow lodgers. Both men commented on how poorly Annie looked. She complained of feeling ill, just too ill to do anything, she said. But she kind of said, it's no use giving way. I must pull myself together and get some money or I shall have no lodgings.
Aww.
And then she left. And don't know what she did, but she left for a little while. She returned at around 1:35 a.m. to this lodging house with a baked potato that she ate in the kitchen. Stood in the kitchen and ate this baked potato. Before the night watchman came round to collect the boarding fee for that night, which she still did not have. So despite the fact that this was a lodging house that she frequented quite a lot, she was friendly with the housekeeper. She actually went up to the office of the housekeeper, Timothy Donovan, and explained that she had no money to pay for a bed that night. And he quite bluntly said that if she couldn't pay, she couldn't stay. So she tells the owner of the lodgings not to worry. She'll go out, get the money, and be back. And he kind of jokes with her a bit, and he says, well, you can find the money for your beer, but not for your bed, which was very often the case.
It's true, yeah.
The money was more often than not spent on alcohol before it was spent on anything else. That generally was the rule of thumb. So before leaving the lodgings for the final time that night, she adds, I won't be long, Brummy. See that Tim keeps the bed for me. Because she was a regular at the lodging, she always had bed number 29. So she then left and walked in the direction of Spitalfields Market, and it's presumed that she left in order to earn some money for her bed via a small bit of prostitution. Because what else would they do? A lot of people shame these victims because they're all prostitutes. Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes and that was it. But they literally had no other way to earn money.
That's zero choice. And the thing is, in England, particularly in London, it's cold, man.
Cold, man.
It's cold. They've got no like goose down puffer jackets and
although you'll
Uggs.
See in a minute, I'll tell you what Annie Chapman was wearing that night.
Oh God, it was a puffer jacket and Uggs.
It was a goose down. Around 5:30 a.m. that morning, Annie Chapman is seen by a woman called Elizabeth Long. She says that Annie is with a man and her back is pressed against the shutters of 29 Hanbury Street and they are talking. Elizabeth hears the man say, "Will you?" And Annie replies, "Yes." And at that time, the clock on the Black Eagle Brewery chimed 5:30 the hour. It's 5:30. A few moments after the sighting by Elizabeth Long, Albert Kadosh, who was a young carpenter who actually lived at 27 Hanbury Street, which was next to 29 Hanbury Street, walks into his backyard, presumably to use the outhouse. And there's a 5-foot wooden fence, like 5-foot tall wooden fence between where he is and the yard of 29 Hanbury, where Annie Chapman is. And he hears voices very close by, and he assumes they're in the yard. Now, they're so close by, and they must be in the yard of 29 Hanbury Street. And the only word that he can make out was the voice of a woman shouting, "No." And then he heard something fall hard against the fence panel. He then goes to the outhouse, goes back indoors, thinks nothing of it. A little before 6 a.m., so she was last spotted at 5:30, and then a little while later, heard out in the garden, and then a little before 6 a.m., so probably about 20 minutes later, John Davis, who was an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, he lived, I believe, on the top floor of Hanbury Street. He came down the stairs to go to work, and he walked along the narrow passageway and opened the back door out into the yard of 29 Hanbury Street. The sight that met his eyes sent him reeling back in horror. And moments later, 2 workmen walking along Hanbury Street that morning were suddenly startled when, from the door of 29 Hanbury Street, John Davis comes stumbling out onto the street, wild-eyed and in a panic. And he says, "Men, come here." So nervously, they kind of follow him along this passageway and look into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, where they saw the mutilated body of Annie Chapman lying on the ground between the steps and the wooden fence. The wooden fence that is the fence between 27 and 29 Hanbury Street. Her head was turned toward the house, and her clothes had been tugged up above her waist, exposing her red and white striped stockings. The men went no further. They ran back out and they flagged down a policeman, Inspector John Chandler, and they said, "Another woman has been murdered." And by the time he got to the crime scene, a crowd had formed. It was 6 a.m, but people generally started their day much earlier back then. So a lot of these people would have been on their way to work. Yeah. There was a lot of people out at that time.
No one had a bed to have a lay in.
No one had a bed. They were kicked out straight away.
Yeah.
Kicked out. So the crowd was, the streets were busy. And yeah, like I've written in there, a lot of people would have been kicked out of their lodgings for the day. So soon to arrive on scene was Dr. George Bagster Phillips. And he describes first seeing Annie's body. And he says, "The left arm was placed across the left breast. The legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outwards. The face was swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protruded between the front teeth, but not beyond the lips. The tongue was evidently much swollen. The front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine teeth they were. The body was terribly mutilated. The stiffness of the limbs were not marked, but was evidently commencing. He noticed that the throat was dissevered deeply, and that the incision through the skin was jagged and reached around the neck. On the wooden fence between the yard in question, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were to be seen. These were about 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part where the body from the neck lay. He actually, at the inquest, said, I can't go in, there's women in the inquest, I can't go into detail about this, the state of the body. He made all the women and children leave. So it was only men in there. And then before because he was like, I'm not going into detail, I'm not doing it. And they was like, you need to. You need to do it. So he asked all the women to leave the inquest. And then he went into detail about the mutilation of Annie's body. And men in there passed out at the description. But scattered around Annie's body were some of the possessions that she carried with her. There was a scrap of muslin, one small tooth comb, one comb in a paper case, a scrap of envelope, like a corner of an envelope containing 2 pills. And this was actually something that the police focused on at first, because there was 2 initials on this scrap of envelope. But it turns out that when Annie had gone back to her lodgings at some point that night, she had a box of pills. They contained 2 pills, but this box had broken. So she just tore off a scrap of envelope and put her pills in it. So bit of a red herring for the police then.
Yeah.
But Annie also had on many layers of clothing. So it was at the end of summer. It was like September time, and it was cold. It's not freezing cold, but a little bit cold. But it was more to the fact that she didn't leave anything at the lodgings. You know, everything that she owned, she wore. She's a bit like Joey. She put on everything she owned. So she couldn't leave them at the lodgings because they'd get stolen. So she had on a long black figured coat that come down to her knees, a black skirt, a brown bodice, and another bodice, 2 petticoats, a large pocket worn under the skirt and tied about the waist with string, which was empty, lace-up boots, red and white striped woolen stockings, and a neckerchief, which was tied around her neck, which was the case actually in Mary Ann Nichols. She also was wearing a neckerchief, and they were both knotted at the neck. But in both cases, they said that was just how women wore it. That wasn't the killer had used it to strangle them. Although they do believe that she was strangled a little bit with it because her tongue was swollen and things. But Dr. Phillips pronounced Annie Chapman dead at the scene. And then he ordered that she be removed to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary in Eagle Street. And before she was removed, the doctor was approached by the police and asked if he should take a picture of Annie's eyes, because he believed, like, as I mentioned before, they believed that back then the retinas would display that the last image that the deceased person had seen would be displayed on the retinas. And I mentioned that because I feel like it's a bit relevant to one of the last victim and what happens to her. So just bear that in mind. But by the time Annie's body was removed, the crowd was like a few hundred deep. You know, this was the same reason like people went and watched hangings and stuff like that. This was entertainment for people. So it was a big old crowd had formed.
They must have been like doing it because they were scared as well, mustn't they? Like they must have been thinking there's someone out there that's like killing these women.
That's not the narrative that I've come across so far. But
I mean, they must have been though, yeah.
But yeah, so people watched as this battered coffin was brought into the yard where Annie's body was. It was then loaded into this coffin, and then from what I read, it said it was placed in the back of an ambulance, but the ambulance was just a horse and cart.
Yeah, it was just a slightly larger cart.
Yes, with a cross on it. And then a few hours later, a post-mortem was conducted. Annie Chapman's body had been mutilated even more than Mary Ann Nichols had been. She had a similar cut across her throat that moved from left to right. However, it was so deep that her head was almost severed. The bones of her vertebrae had been like scored with this knife, and not just nicked. They were like, it looked as though it had been an attempt to cut her head off.
Oh, God.
She had a large jagged gash in her abdomen and had been disemboweled. Her intestines had been taken out and placed on the ground over her right shoulder, though still connected to her body, and sections of flesh from her stomach and intestines had also been removed and placed over her right shoulder. No, left shoulder. Chapman's uterus and 2/3 of her bladder had been removed as well. And then since there was no trace of these anywhere, they assumed that the killer had taken them with him. All this had been done in the pitch black morning in under 30 minutes. We're talking 15 to 20 minutes. Goodness. So the thing that astounded the doctor was how precise and clean these cuts were. And just this is something that I've put in here because we focus a lot on the actual crime. You know, this is what he done. We don't really focus on the astonishing feat that this crime was.
Yeah.
So just imagine the scene. Okay. It's 5:30 a.m. It's dark outside. You're crammed into a small backyard area where people are sleeping. There's plenty of people in that house. There's plenty of people next door. They're actually all getting up and getting ready for work. You quickly cut the throat of the woman who falls to the floor. She's not going to have fallen flat on the floor. She's not going to have fallen flat on her back. So he would have likely have had to have moved her into some sort of position that would have been easy for him to then cut her open. He then takes her possessions out of her pockets and places them precariously around her body. And she's wearing many layers. And he didn't just cut through all of the layers. He's had to either remove them or undo them and move them out the way. You know, all of these things are taking time. He then slices from her abdomen, sternum to pelvis. Okay. And they say jaggedly. And they mentioned jaggedly in the first one. Yeah. But what they're saying by jagged is that it goes from sternum down and then around the navel and then down. There's a small little jagged there where he avoids the navel, which is, they think that it's a very jagged cut.
Yeah.
But if you Google it, autopsy technicians are taught not to cut through the navel, to go around it. So that's an interesting piece of information. But that's what they mean by jagged cut. It's not just like this slash everywhere. Yeah. It's a straight cut and then a jagged around the navel and then back down again. So he certainly doesn't rip her open. He doesn't stab the knife in and rip it straight down. He doesn't go through any tissue that he doesn't intend to go through. It's a very precise cut.
Deliberate.
So once he's cut through the flesh, the fat, the muscle, he exposes the intestines. Now, everything in the body is connected by like sinew and tissue. You know, nothing is loose in the body for you to just take out. Sorry if this is making you queasy.
It is.
And everything is crammed in, you know. There's a lot of things inside your tummy. So you don't just open the body and go, there's the uterus, there's the bladder. I'll quickly whip them out. That's not how it works. He has to sever the intestines from their mesenteric attachments, so all the sinew and tissue. He has to get rid of all of that to be able to take them out. He then removes them and places them above Annie's shoulder, and above. He then takes a portion of the stomach, removes that, and places that above the left shoulder. And you've got to remember as well that it's dark.
Yeah.
Okay. He then removes
torch, nothing.
No torch. He could have potentially had a lamp. However, the first witness mentioned seeing a man with Annie very shortly before her death, and there was no mention of a lamp.
No, and also that I would have thought they wouldn't want to.
That would have drawn more attention.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't think that there was a lamp. So he then removes the uterus and the appendages that attaches to the uterus, so the fallopian tubes and things, along with the upper portion of the vagina, and then for the posterior 2/3 of the bladder had been entirely removed. All of that was removed.
Whoa.
And I don't want to get too anatomical with all the names of everything.
Yeah.
But all of these excuse me, all of these organs are attached to a lot of different things, ligaments and blood vessels, and also the ligaments attach them to other organs. Nothing else was hit or nicked, or it was what he took out was what he wanted to take out. So the bladder itself is located in the lower part of the abdomen, quite far down, and it's connected via the ureters, which go above, so from the bladder up into the kidneys, and then the urethra, which is obviously below. And it's held in place by different ligaments that attach them to other organs and attach it to the pelvis itself. You don't just whip out the bladder.
No.
And all these organs as well have the connective tissue that attach them within your body. Otherwise, they would just be flying about all over the place.
Yeah.
They're not attached anywhere. You're doing star jumps. They're just flying about.
Yeah.
So all of these cuts were very precise, very practiced, very methodical. It's gonna be dark. He's gonna have blood on his hands, his slippery knife, whatever else. This was the work of a very professional person, in my opinion, and not the work of a crazy killer. Huh?
It certainly comes across that way.
Yeah. So he's called Jack the Ripper, but he by no means ripped apart these women. These were very, very calculated movements that he'd done. The body also had other post-mortem mutilations, different stab marks in different places. But based on all of this, the doctor deduced that this was the work of someone with great anatomical knowledge. He actually said that he himself could not have performed all the injuries that he described. Even without a struggle, had the woman not struggled, he wouldn't have been able to do that in under a quarter of an hour. If he says, this is a quote, if he had done it in a deliberate way, such as was full to the duties of a surgeon, it would probably have taken him the best part of an hour. And this was all done between 15 to 30 minutes. But like I said, I think probably closer to 15 to 20 minutes this was all done.
Yeah.
And the doctor concluded in the post-mortem that Annie had actually been suffering with a disease that affected her lungs and brain, and most likely tuberculosis, and that if she hadn't have been murdered, she would have likely died in a very short amount of time. Anyways. An inquest again was held after her death. Witnesses came forward, character witnesses, the mortician, but literally no clues to go on apart from the sightings. They said that it was somebody in a deerstalker hat with like a trench coat type thing.
Deerstalker hat?
Deerstalker hat, like a Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And it was said that she was 100% killed in the place where she was found. And police said, quote, "It seems astonishing at first thought that the culprit should have escaped detection, for there must surely have been marks of blood about this person. If, however, blood was principally on his hand, the presence of so many slaughterhouses in the neighbourhood would make the frequenters of this spot familiar with blood-stained clothes and hands, and his appearance might in that way have failed to attract attention while he passed from Bucks Row in the twilight into Whitechapel Row and was lost sight of in the morning's market traffic." So there's people everywhere, and he's literally slip, slap, slop, murdered Annie Chapman, and up he went and just walked into the crowds of people.
Yeah, like hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
Has never been more relevant.
Yeah. Yeah. Also at the inquest, this statement was made to the police, and it says, "We cannot altogether leave unnoticed the fact that the death that you have been investigating is one of 4 presenting many points of similarity, all of which have occurred within the space of about 5 months, and all within a very short distance of the place that we are sitting. All 4 victims were women of middle age, all were married and had lived apart from their husbands in consequence of intemperate habits, and were at the time of their death leading an irregular life." And the newspapers obviously ran an article about it the following day, which I will read you. And it says, "Ghastly murder in the East End, dreadful mutilation of a woman, capture of leather apron." And it says, "Another murder of a character even more diabolical than that perpetrated in Bucks Row on Friday week was discovered in the same neighbourhood on Saturday morning. At about 6 o'clock, a woman was found lying in a backyard at the foot of a passage leading to a lodging house in Old Browns Lane, Spitalfields. The house is occupied by a Mrs. Richardson, who lets it out to lodgers, and the door which admits to this passage at the foot of which lies the yard where the body was found is always open for the convenience of lodgers." So it was actually said that this lodging place, it was quite, it was left open. This yard was used quite frequently for people to come and go. A lodger named Davis was going down to work at the time mentioned and found the woman lying on her back close to the flight of steps leading into the yard. Her throat was cut in a fearful manner. The woman's body had been completely ripped open, and the heart and other organs lying about the place, and portions of the entrails round the victim's neck. An excited crowd gathered in front of Mrs. Richardson's house, and also round the mortuary in Old Montague Street, where the body was quickly conveyed. As the body lies in the rough coffin in which it has been placed in the mortuary, the same coffin in which the unfortunate Mrs. Nichols was first placed, it presents a fearful sight. The body is that of a woman about 45 years of age. The height is exactly 5 feet. The complexion is fair, with wavy brown hair. The eyes are blue, and 2 lower teeth have been knocked out. The nose is rather large and prominent. And that's the newspaper article. So I just find it so, it just baffles me. They're really, really into so many of them, but I've picked obviously the one that I wanted the most. But there's so many of them. They're all quite a very similar narrative. But I find it strange that in every single one, they talk about how excited this crowd was.
Yeah.
So it's
entertainment, like you say.
It's absolutely.
Yeah.
Jeez. And that's what I mean. I don't get the narrative that these were fearful residents of Whitechapel.
No, I guess, yeah. I suppose some of the women, especially the women that were having to sort of prostitute themselves, there must have been a point fairly early on where they thought...
I can't remember who it was. One of the victims, it could well have been Annie Chapman, while she was standing in the kitchen talking to these people and said, "Oh, I'm going back out again to earn my lodgings." Yeah. They said, "Aren't you worried about this murderer?" And they was like, he won't get me. It's quite a jovial, so I can look after myself. Don't worry, he'll never get me. I don't remember which victim it was, but I'll do some more research. It could have been Annie Chapman, but I'll come back to that in the next episode.
Well, whoever it was that she was talking to was probably the Jack the Ripper.
Maybe.
Probably, and he won't get me. Like, I'm tough as nails. And he's probably standing there thinking, right, you're next.
In your face.
Yeah, in your face.
So police were really under pressure to find the culprit or culprits. They didn't know. And as named before, Leather Apron kept coming up. And at the scene of Annie Chapman's murder, police actually found a bloody leather apron in a bucket of... I don't know if it was in a bucket of water or just in a bucket, but it was near like a water spigot in the backyard. And the police actually commented that there was no blood on the spigot itself. And they then kind of said that that's how audacious this killer was, that he hadn't even bothered to wash his hands.
Yeah.
He could have washed his hands and he was like, no one's even going to notice anyway. So But so they located the owner of this apron, and it was actually somebody that lived at that lodging house, but he was very quickly cleared. He had nothing to do with it. Police, however, did arrest a man named William Pigott. And he came to the attention of police after the landlady of the Pope's Head public house in Gravesend in Kent heard him at the bar yelling his hatred and hostility towards women. So she called the police and said, he'd a bit dodgy. And when police arrived to question him, they found him dazed, confused, and covered in blood. And this was the next day or the day of Annie Chapman's murder. This was very close by. And he, although he was covered in blood, they also noticed that his shoes looked like they had been covered in blood, but had been wiped clean. So when questioned at the police station, William made this kind of rambling statement, and he explained that on Sunday morning, the 9th of September in 1888, in Brick Lane, he had come to the aid of a woman who he had seen having a fit and had fallen. So he rushed over, being the good guy that he was. He attempted to help her up, but she bit him on the hand and caused this wound that he had. That's why he was covered in blood. He had blood on his shirt. He had wounds all over his hands. And he got bit by her, and then he was like slapped around the face, and then saw two policemen come in and then ran away. And they also, I don't know where this come about, but it says that they recovered a paper parcel that William had actually left at a fish and pie stall. And this paper parcel contained 2 blood-stained shirts. So I don't know how they were notified of where this parcel came in or where he'd left it, but apparently he had this parcel and it contained 2 blood-stained shirts. So he was brought back to London and then held in a lineup to see if this man was Leather Apron, if this man was the man that they were all talking about. But no one picked him out. One person picked him out and then kind of said, actually, I don't think it's him.
Maybe, but
maybe not. But he was deemed to be a lunatic and then released. And it was said that he was actually later sent to an insane asylum.
So they think he's a lunatic, and they're like, "Off you go,
off you go, covered in blood for no reason."
Back onto the streets of London.
Yeah, they had no reason. They couldn't connect him to any crime or anything, so they had to let him go. But yeah, it was said that he was later sent to an insane asylum. And he was in the insane asylum when the rest of the murders were committed. So probably not him. But shortly after William's arrest, for being this suspected Leather Apron / murderer, they did actually manage to track down the real infamous Leather Apron. And he was arrested on the 10th of September. And his name was John Pizer. And he was a Jewish leather worker. And he had previous arrests for like indecent assault and things like that against prostitutes, against women and stuff.
Nice.
And after the papers had picked up his name, after the police had originally questioned the working ladies after Mary Ann Nichols' murder, the newspaper kind of splashed his name about everywhere. He'd actually gone on the run. So he thought, they're going to pin the murder on me. So he went on the run. So that's why it took police a long time to actually get him. So police interviewed him and they actually managed to corroborate his alibi for both murders, and he was released the next day. With no other leads in Annie Chapman's murder, the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street was cleaned up and the public were somewhat subdued. That was until a few weeks later. The London police station received a letter on the 29th of September, written in red, addressed simply to the boss. And that's where we're going to leave part 1.
Oh man, I'm just getting into all this. I'm like, right, okay, letter.
Yep. So in part 2, we will discuss the letter, the double event, and the other letters.
Oh, that's cool. Thank you. I enjoyed the first of Many.
The first of many. I haven't finished it because it's going to take me so long, but it's going to be the first of at least 3.
At least
3. So
cool.
I hope we really wanted to do a big story for our 100th episode, and so it's going to be the 100th, the 101, 102.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big story. This is a story that I've wanted to do for a while, and I started it a few months ago, but I was too overwhelmed and I couldn't do it. So
yeah, well, it's very fitting for our 100th episode because it's a case that's like huge and it's a case that's close to us.
Yeah,
like geographically.
Yeah,
we've grown up hearing about Jack the Ripper and things like that. So yeah, great story to do, and I can't wait to hear the next one.
Good.
Awesome.
Thank
you very much.
All right then.
All right, well, catch you all on the next one. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. If you have enjoyed listening to our episodes, make sure you rate us and leave us a review on whatever platform you are listening.
We absolutely love hearing from you guys. So you can also help support our show by donating to our Buy Me a Coffee link. We will make sure that you get a massive shout out and a big thank you in our next week's episode.
You can also follow us on social media at Perplexed Podcasts. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and if you want to see more videos and blooper reels, subscribe to our TikTok and YouTube channels.
You can also email us your stories at perplexedpodcasts@gmail.com.
And you can find all the relevant links in the episode descriptions. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Is that a mince pie or a...
It's pork pie.
Pork pie, that's what I meant, a pork pie.
Yeah.
Celebratory pork pie.
I'm not really having sugar, so I love pork pie. Whoop whoop. We're having our celebration.
Oh, well, that's nice. Thank you, darling. You're supposed to be on a meeting.
Happy 100.
Happy 100th. Whoop, whoop.